International leaders visit Ukraine to mark its Independence Day as President Volodymyr Zelenskyy again rejects calls for a wartime election. But domestic pressure has been growing while Russian and Ukrainian attacks intensify. So what's the impact? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Ukraine marks its 5th Independence Day since Russia's full-scale invasion. Now, some Western leaders were there to show their support. Domestically, though, President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is under pressure. The war is intensifying, and Ukraine is running low on the US-made interceptors it uses to defend itself from Russian missiles. And in Russia, long-range Ukrainian drone attacks have been hitting targets deep inside that country. And Zelenskyy has been in office since 2019. Elections have been suspended since the invasion. Yet the president has rejected calls from his former defense minister to hold a vote. Some of Zelenskyy's inner circle are also being investigated for corruption. So what's the impact of all of this? Well, we'll discuss that shortly with our guests. But first, this report from Wilson Dysart.
As Ukraine marks its Independence Day, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is facing domestic political pressure to hold elections, despite the war with Russia. It's coming from his former defense minister, Mikhailo Fedorov. He was removed last month after a split with the head of the armed forces, who was also fired.
Democracy cannot be held hostage by Russia. We must find a lawful, safe and realistic mechanism that will allow Ukraine to restore a fully functioning democratic process, even under conditions of a long war.
Zelenskyy's been in office since 2019, and he's ruled out elections in wartime, saying they would tear the country apart. On Sunday, for the first time, the president spoke to reporters about firing Fedorov.
I really had, and still have, a very positive attitude towards Mikhailo. We have been through a lot together, but I believe that he himself goes or is pushed into the wrong things.
Fedorov's dismissal prompted protests in Kiev, with demonstrators expressing support for elections and Fedorov, who's credited with playing a central role in upgrading Ukraine's drone capability. Fedorov's supporters said he offered them hope for an end to the conflict, an end to corruption, and ultimately victory for Ukraine.
In my opinion, Fedorov is a completely new kind of leader, of a completely new level, and at the same time he is very, very successful. He doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. His projects, which he undertook, generally prove this, unlike, say, the leadership of our armed forces, unfortunately, which so far prove the opposite. And everyone sees this too, and most importantly, we see it.
The domestic political tensions come at a possibly pivotal time in the conflict, with Ukraine running low on Patriot interceptors, the only defense against Russia's most advanced missiles. But Ukraine's drones have been striking deep into Russia, hitting energy facilities, attacks that have led to fuel shortages there. In a speech marking Independence Day on Monday, Zelenskyy pointed to the attacks on energy sites as a sign of Ukrainian resolve.
Putin hopes that we have become tired. We know that he is mortal. He has never understood us. Now it is too late for him to do so. You wanted to take all of Ukraine, all our land, but instead you have lost your oil refineries, your navy, your profits, and an entire generation, which you sent into the meat grinder.
But with the war intensifying and the civilian toll rising, the pressure is growing on President Zelenskyy to provide answers regarding Ukraine's political future. Wilson Dysart, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's bring in our panel of guests. Joining us from Kyiv is Oleksandr Sushko, Executive Director of the International Renaissance Foundation, a major Ukrainian charitable organization, and the former co-chair of the EU-Ukraine Civil Society Platform. Also in the Ukrainian capital, Oleksiy Haran, professor of comparative politics at National University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and head of research at the Democratic Initiatives Foundation. And joining us from Phuket, Thailand is Michael Bociurkiw, a global affairs analyst and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. A warm welcome to you all. If I could start with Oleksandr. So is Ukraine in urgent need of election, as the former defense minister's call would suggest? What's your take?
Hypothetically, Ukraine really needs a mechanism of rotation of power, as it's already 7 years after the last elections we had. However, neither technically nor politically elections are possible today. So it's impossible because of the variety of reasons. So current legal framework is totally not prepared to elections, and the constitution and the laws ban the elections during the martial law. And it is unlikely that Ukraine will be able to withdraw from the martial law because the war is continuing and there is no way out of this situation. So,
Oleksandr, I hear what you're saying. And I think it's a view that is shared by many in Ukraine. But it's not only the former defense minister that's making that call right now. The former foreign minister, Dmytro Kuleba, has spoke of the political system degrading, about the need for elections. Why are we hearing from senior figures who should understand the sort of challenges you're talking about, nevertheless saying this is an issue that needs to be addressed soon?
You are right. But none of the figures you mentioned could offer the legitimate way to solve the problems which Ukraine faces in the context of conducting democratic elections. How can the government ensure that the people who are currently displaced can vote? Those who are abroad, millions of Ukrainians abroad, how can they vote? Millions of people in the armed forces, how can they vote? And how can the security be ensured as Russia continues its shelling every day? So there are no response on this. And that is why I'm very skeptical about any call to elections immediately. All
right. Professor Oleksiy, with all the good reasons, I would say, that Oleksandr has given us of why this would be a challenge to have elections now, but if you follow that logic through, does that mean that Ukraine remains for an unknown, unlimited period of time without elections? Something that prompted Fedorov, the former defense minister, to say, we can't have democracy held hostage by this conflict. Does he have a point at least on that?
Okay, so first of all, Fedorov didn't call for early elections. He said as a principle, okay, so we need elections. And that's what Ukrainians are saying. All the polls, they show that Ukrainians would like to have the possibility to change the authorities, whatever would be the result of future elections. You know, we are a democratic country. But at the same time, polls show that most overwhelming majority of Ukrainians, they say that to conduct elections, we need at least half a year after stable ceasefire. Stable ceasefire is minimum requirement to prepare for elections. So basically, given, Russian attack, you're putting the question, what should we do if it continues? We don't know for how long it will continue. We don't know. Maybe the world would be able to press Putin to stop it. I always hope for that, but unfortunately, there's not enough solidarity with Ukraine, with the victim of aggression from the world. Yeah, many countries are supporting us, but many countries choose so-called pragmatic approach. We're neutral. We're neutrally watching how Ukraine is destroyed by Russian ballistic missiles. So we don't know if the world unites efforts to stop Putin, then we would be able to conduct elections. Otherwise, again, whatever we can think We want elections, we would like to conduct it, we would like to vote in a democratic way. It's impossible to do during the war.
Okay. You mentioned the polls, so let me remind us of the research that was conducted by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, which found a small minority of Ukrainians, around 19%, saying elections should be held before the war is over. A slim majority, though, say that the government should wait until the end of the war. Nearly a quarter of respondents say, well, they simply weren't sure. As well as all the reasons that have been given by our other guests, surely, Michael, in Phuket, this is something that's not lost on figures like the former, whether it's the former defense minister or whether it's the former foreign minister. Why are we hearing people like Fedorov talk then about having elections before the war ends? Is it that they think they can change public opinion, or do they see some leverage for them?
Sure. Well, just for clarity, I did speak to the former Foreign Affairs Minister, Dmytro Kuleba, for my world briefing on Substack, and he did clarify to me that, yes, there should be elections only when the Ukrainian people call for it. Now, that poll you referred to is quite interesting because there seems to be a softening in opposition to elections during wartime. But as our esteemed co-panelists outlined, there are many reasons why they just cannot happen. Among the biggest, so many millions of Ukrainians displaced internally, but especially overseas.
Michael, that's really interesting. Are you saying public opinion might be turning around in Ukraine?
Yes, and I think that is driven in part by, well, in large part by these corruption scandals that don't seem to be going away. You know, and you go to Kyiv, and I'm usually based in Odessa, I'm in Kyiv often, and people do ask themselves, do tell themselves, it seems there's a lot of money sloshing around by people who have profited from this war, and that it's a very complicated situation. But that also leads to the situation with Fedorov, the ousted defense minister, that he was someone that young people, a lot of people in Mr. Zelensky's traditional base, he was representing their views, I think, and saying, enough is enough. We have to clean up the mess. And let me give you a quick example here. Speaking of messes, you know, Mr. Zelenskyy at that press conference on the weekend you referred to said that there's a huge multi-billion-dollar shortfall in the defense budget. And it boggles the mind considering how much money has been pledged by donors to Ukraine. And just quickly, I spoke to a serving senior soldier in the armed forces just before leaving Odessa a few days ago. And he told me that the men on the front line, the men and women on the front line are only getting 60% of what they need. The other 40%, they're having to pass the hat around on Facebook. So with the troops there for so long at the front line, this war is going into its fifth war, of course. This goes down to the families and to others. And, you know, I think people are really, at the end of the day, calling for a cleanup of the corruption and also mismanagement.
That's really interesting. Let me take that point back to Oleksandr in Kyiv. In the minds of people, do you think that there will come a point where, despite the challenges you mentioned, Oleksandr, of things like how do you hold elections for the people who are living in parts of Ukraine controlled by Russia? How do you hold elections for the missing? How do you hold elections for refugees and so on? But in the minds of people who are suffering, the types of people Michael is talking about, who are getting only 60% of what they need and having to go to Facebook, do you think eventually that might outweigh those types of challenges that you rightly referred to, Oleksandr?
Yeah, you are right that time is not on the side of President Zelenskyy. And he feels really there is a problem with his public support. However, he is still supported by the majority of the population. So he probably does not feel this is a point of the ultimate crisis so far. So that is why, and again, there is no good plan how to do this. So there is no scenario how to conduct elections under current situation, and there is no model. There is no international experience how to conduct democratic elections under such war conditions. So that is why the majority of experts, the majority of stakeholders have rather very skeptical attitude to the idea of immediate election. But it may change, you are right. We don't know what happens next year, for example, if the government will continue to be under such a criticism.
All right, and it might change. Does some of that, it might change, depend, Oleksiy, on what happens too in the corruption scandals? Let's not forget that factor, which Michael pointed out.
Guys, look, again, we need elections, right? You know, many people are dissatisfied with Zelenskyy. A lot of people still believe Zelenskyy. And yes, he has a positive balance of trust and distrust. Plus 15. For the 5th year of the war, this is quite high. But it may decrease. But again, you know, to conduct elections when you are bombarded every day, the elections is not the day of election. This is the last point. Elections should be done in a democratic way. We need elections not just to tick the box. People would like to express themselves during this electoral campaign, to have an equal campaign, to have just electoral campaign. We cannot do it under Russian bombardment. So, my recipe for conducting elections: put the pressure, all the world, put the pressure on Putin to have at least ceasefire. That's the way to conduct elections. Otherwise, yes, it will be very, they may be undermined, you know, at any point by Russian bombardments. And then Russia would say, look, there are no legitimate elections in Ukraine. So that's the answer. Let's have conditions for election, and then we will be happy to proceed. Ukraine is the most democratic country on the so-called post-Soviet space, with exception of the Baltic countries. You showed, you know, the manifestation. This is done under martial law. And actually under martial law, you know, manifestations are prohibited. But still, there is a possibility to conduct meetings and manifestations, because we understand it's important. And because also the government is to take it into account. The government is not able just to crush it. No. So democracy is functioning even under martial law. And we are in possibility to to criticize President Zelenskyy very strongly. That's what I am doing. I am criticizing him all the time. But in the issue of elections, basically he is right, saying that it will only destabilize the country and will be used by Russia.
Okay, we're talking about criticism then. A poll conducted this summer by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology found public trust in Ukraine's presidency has dropped from its highs at the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion, but confidence in Ukraine's parliament and Zelenskyy's cabinet is far lower. Trust in Ukraine's armed forces, however, remains nearly as high as it was at the start of the war. So with that in mind, Michael, what happens in the battlefield going forward, to some extent, to a great extent, is going to determine Zelenskyy's popularity? Is that part of the message that we can read from polls like that?
Yeah, sure. There's a direct link between what's happening on the ground and how people feel towards Zelenskyy. But let me get a couple of things out of the way here. First of all, I covered Mr. Zelenskyy's campaign, and I distinctly remember him saying, I am a one-term president. I will not run again. I wish at that press conference on the weekend, my colleagues would have asked him, do you want to run again? And I think if he declared, look, my term ended quite some time ago, I'm not running again, I'm only a caretaker wartime president, I think that will bring some relief to people who have he's disappointed, as those polls indicate. The other thing is my friend Daria Kolonyuk said, she's an anti-corruption campaigner. She said, Mr. Zelenskyy, let's not forget, does have the benefit of the state behind him. She said he seems to be the only politician that is using those resources to sideline opponents, to get rid of them, move them somewhere else. And there's also been allegations of Telegram channels anonymously used to tarnish opponents. But, you know, in terms of those polls, take last winter when many Ukrainians described it to me, and I was there for most of it, as hell on earth because of the lack of power, lack of heating, lack of water. And a lot of Ukrainians deservedly drew a direct line between the multi-million-dollar corruption scandal that had erupted as they went into the winter to the lack of protection on power plants because that money was siphoned away. It happened under Zelensky's watch. I don't want to come out as the only critic of him in this panel, but I think there are things, cleanups that he can do to make people feel more confident that the government is in good hands. And just to wrap this part up, in the meantime, what can allies of Ukraine do, such as Canada? Well, there are technical assistance things. Get Ukraine ready in the background, the Central Election Commission, things like that, ready for when the day comes, and it will come, when elections can be held properly and fairly and safely.
All right, let me take those points to Professor Oleksiy once again in Kyiv. Briefly, Professor, given some of those steps which Michael outlined that President Zelenskyy could take to try and address some of the concerns in the country, how optimistic are you that he would be able, he's in a position to try and meet some of those concerns, given the array of challenges before him, some of which depend on outside forces and outside powers? I mean, you've called for outside help for Ukraine, for the world to intervene. Ukraine needs weapons interceptors. Is it clear? It needs security guarantees. It's asking for all kinds of things. Is there really that clarity that it's going to get it from its Western partners? Not to mention the diplomacy faltering, and winter is approaching once again.
Actually, Ukrainians do understand the problems that he faces and Ukraine faces in relations with the outside world. As far, I have already said that some of the countries are staying neutral, some of the countries providing huge support, some of the countries decrease this support. So Ukrainians understand the problem president have in relation with the outside world. Ukrainians also understand, by the way, whenever we have a pressure from abroad on Zelenskyy, his popularity increases. Okay, so Ukrainians do not, even those who are critical to Zelenskyy, they do not like when, for example, somebody in the West is mentoring President Zelenskyy or Ukraine in general, what to do. Yeah, you show the right video. Yeah. So I think the main problem for Zelenskyy, yes, is to dealing with domestic issues and first of all with rule of law and corruption. Okay. So that's what Ukrainians would like to change. That's clear. But if you do not have elections, how can you ensure that there are some changes in the government? The answer is coalition government, government of national unity, government of national salvation, whatever you use. Actually, this was supposed within Ukraine for many years, right. Actually since the beginning of the aggression. So now it's up to President Zelenskyy to say, okay, I'm ready for it.
Okay, let me take it for a brief point. I think we've got about a minute and a half left, back to Oleksandr Sushko. So when we talk about a lot of these issues that now the conversation has gone towards, is really the US at the center of a lot of them, whether we're talking about, you know, the need for further security guarantees, help with missile interceptors, or even the very issue of elections. You remember the calls started, I think, outside of Ukraine with Lindsey Graham in 2023 raising this issue. So does a lot of what happens next, not only for Zelenskyy, but for Ukraine, really depend on the US position?
I think it's now not on the agenda of US-Ukraine relations. but it's a part of domestic agenda. I do not. I heard that, for example, European leaders never say that Ukraine needs immediate elections or something like this. So it's rather domestic election moment so far, and certainly there is no good solution. We have to accept the reality that Ukraine is challenged by the situation, and nobody knows how to do it properly. So that is why I think the major and the wide dialogue is needed, and the president has an opportunity to be an initiator of the wider political dialogue between different stakeholders, including the civil society, on the next steps. How can we proceed, taking into account that there is no legitimate opportunity for elections right now?
Okay, let me go back to Michael and ask very briefly a final point. Whatever happens in this conversation about whether elections can happen now or cannot happen now, does the whole conversation show that there is a new, younger, reform-minded political force that is rising in the country?
Yeah, absolutely there is. And they're very hungry, they're eager to see reforms happen. And don't forget, a lot of them are overseas, millions of them. And I have talked to a lot of them, and they tell me, we're not going back to the old Ukraine, that is it, unless the cleanup happens. And you know what else? There's something that Mr. Zelenskyy and allies can do today in Kyiv or even tomorrow. And that is, if you want to tackle corruption and you want to get the country ready for a free, fair, democratic election, start pumping millions of dollars back into the media sector that has been decimated by this war, because they are a check against corruption, and they will distribute information, crucial information, during an election. But Mr. Zelenskyy has not done that. In fact, he's put restrictions on the media. He's corralled the main channels into a so-called telemarathon, which shouts out a lot of opposition voices. That needs to change. It needs $20 million at least, or plus, we've looked into this, for the media sector to come back. It's crucial for Ukraine to have that going, and it's never been discussed at any of the reconstruction conferences chaired by Mr. Zelenskyy's team.
All right, but it's been discussed here now, so thank you for raising it, Michael. And let's thank all of our guests, in fact, Oleksandr Sushko, Professor Oleksiy Haran, and Michael Bociurkiw. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stay tuned.